Vandeham Sri Guru Sri Kamalam Sri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Sri Rupam Sagrajataham Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Varijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Sri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Sri Vishakhanutamscha Amagyanatimirandasya Gyanangana Sharakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namaha Siddhantutpalasara Nityarasikam Ham Samvilasatmakam Audaryakya Sudhamasi Vakaranam Vishram Bhakti Pradam Yachna Yukti Vichakshanam Dvagavido Vaishishta Shaktiya Sada Vandeham Tripurarinamakyatim Sri Bhakti Vedandinam Namo Bhaktivinodaya Satchidananda Namine Gaura Shakti Swarupaya Rupanuga Varayati Anjakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyaivacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gauratvishe Namaha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namastute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasari Shri Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Nama Eva Kevalam Kalo Nastyeva Gatiranyatha. Welcome, dear devotees. Thank you for being here with me today. Thank you, Anangamanjari, for interpreting. Sakirati for helping me set up all these things. I was already panicking here. Welcome, Chris, Saragrahi, Guido, Krishna Kumari. And maybe there are more that I don't see, but I wish you all very welcome. I'm very happy to have been again asked to speak, and I'm very happy to speak with you all today on the glories of our great grandfather, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, whose divine appearance day it is today. We've heard many times from Guru Maharaj how we are members of the Bhaktivinoda Parivar, the family of Bhaktivinoda. And we are members of the family of Bhaktivinoda in two different ways. We're members of the movement that stems from him. Without Bhaktivinoda Thakur, there wouldn't have been any Bhaktisiddhanta. There wouldn't have been any Prabhupada without Bhaktisiddhanta. There wouldn't have been any Guru Maharaj without Prabhupada. So without Bhaktivinoda Thakur, we would exist, but we wouldn't know each other. I probably wouldn't have met any of you without Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And I'm very happy for this, that I'm part of a movement that has brought together people from so many different backgrounds. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he used to muse like this: when will that day be? When people from Russia, Prussia, England, and France will come together and sing the glories of the Lord. And we live in such a day when people from all different nationalities have come together. Thanks to Bhaktivinoda Thakur. We're also members of the family of Bhaktivinoda Thakur in an even more literal sense. He is our spiritual father's father. We are spiritually the descendants of Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Here in the Nordic countries, they say that grandchildren are the dessert of life. Children, they are kind of a work to bring up. That's a big challenge and a big effort for parents. But then with grandchildren, it's just kind of fun. It's kind of the dessert. You just take care of the grandkids when you want, and they're just fun for you. Whenever they are getting much to take care of, you just call the parents and they will pick them up, something like that. So similarly, from the other perspective, children might think that their parents are sometimes embarrassing or they're too strict or something like that. But the grandparents, they're always fun. And grandparents might think that children might be irritating, or they don't live up to the expectations they have. But grandchildren are just fun. So whatever the grandchildren do, the grandparents will be happy. Even more so. I mean, I don't have any grandchildren, but I could imagine that if I had grandchildren, I would think like this. And if I would have grandchildren's children, I would be probably even more amazed by how wonderful they are. And if I had grandchildren's children's children, how amazed I would be with them. And this is our relationship to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He is seeing that, oh, over there is this Guido. What a wonderful devotee he is. Over there is Krishna Kumari. What a wonderful devotee. She knows all these mantras and she knows how to do puja. How amazing it is. So we have this connection to this very, very loving and compassionate great, great grandfather who we can remember on days like today. In my previous classes, in these weekly Tattva Viveka classes, I have spoken about the Srimad Bhagavatam. I've spoken about the greatness of the Srimad Bhagavatam. I've spoken about some challenges we might have in reading the Srimad Bhagavatam, and so on. And today I wanted to combine these two topics, the topic of Bhaktivinoda Thakur and the topic of the Srimad Bhagavatam. Because I really feel that as Gaudiya Vaishnava devotees, we should speak more about the Srimad Bhagavatam. This is, after all, our central text. Srimad Bhagavatam Pramanamamalam. Srimad Bhagavata, Srinatha Chakravarti tells us, is the faultless evidence. It's the most important pramana, the most important source of knowledge that we have. So this is a text that we should, all of us, study again and again. And it's not difficult to join this text to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. As a Gaudiya Vaishnava of a very special kind, Bhaktivinoda Thakur engaged extensively with the Srimad Bhagavatam from the very beginning of his devotional life to the end. I think Bhaktivinoda Thakur's last published work, published just a little while before he left this world, is a book called Srimad Bhagavata, Bhagavatarka Marichimala, a garland of rays from the sun of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is a book where Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur collected verses and kind of made a garland of these verses. So he picked out verses that he thought were particularly important. And this is an interesting text, but it's a text for another day. Today I wanted to focus on a text which is very much from the beginning of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's, we could say, career as a Gaudiya Vaishnava author. The text I will focus on today is popularly called the Bhagavata speech. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he called this text the Bhagavat, its philosophy, its ethics, and its theology. It's a speech that Bhaktivinoda Thakur gave in 1869 in a place called Dinajpur in Bengal. 1869 is very early in the career of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. He wasn't Bhaktivinoda at this time yet. That was still many years in the future. He hadn't received this title yet. In fact, he hadn't even received initiation. This talk was given 11 years before he received initiation in 1880. So 1869. He's very much still a young person, a young seeker of truth. But he has by now come across the Srimad Bhagavata. In his autobiography, written many years later, he writes, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, about how difficult it was in those days to get hold of the Bhagavatam as a book. The Bhagavatam was something people spoke about, people had an opinion about, but actually reading the book wasn't so easy. So it took him a long time before he managed to procure a copy of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And the reason why he set out to find the Srimad Bhagavatam was that he had read something about Sri Chaitanya Dev. And he had become very attracted by the kind of teachings that Chaitanya was promulgating. And of course, central in Chaitanya's teaching is the Srimad Bhagavatam. So by 1869, Bhaktivinoda Thakur had started studying the Srimad Bhagavatam. And it had made a profound change in his life. A profound change in his understanding of religion, of spirituality. So this talk represents his understanding of the Srimad Bhagavatam at this time. As we shall see, it's very much the talk of a young, liberal, reform-minded Hindu Bhadralok person. Bhadralok means like this kind of upper middle class person who are concerned about very different things than people from other social classes. A person who has received a Western education and who is trying to somehow make sense of how to view the world. The old models do not hold up anymore. Science, Western philosophy has shown that many of the things that their forefathers used to believe in are simply not true. So what to do then with all these old texts and traditions? Bhaktivinoda begins his talk on the Bhagavatam by saying that this is a text that has been very much misunderstood. He says that we as human beings, we love to read something new and learn something new. And this curiosity is something that we should make use of. To look for new books, to look for new insights. But when reading, we have to avoid two types of bad reading or unproductive reading. The first, Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls the useless reader. The useless reader is the reader that is not reflexive. He gives the example of the moon. The moon is useful because it reflects the light of the sun towards us. A useless reader is a reader who simply reads the book and doesn't think at all. Simply reads it as a parrot, but never passes anything on, never reflects anything from the book, neither within herself, nor gives out anything of what she has read to anybody else. So this Bhaktivinoda Thakur calls a useless reader, a reader who is simply letting the eyes flow over the text, but nothing actually happens. The other kind of a poor reader that Bhaktivinoda speaks about is what he calls the shallow critic. The shallow critic is the person who gets upset with everything. Aha! In this book, when they speak about the spiritual practicant, they always speak about he. This must be from a patriarchic society. This is useless. Let's get rid of it. We'll throw away the book. Or any other example. This book speaks about Earth being flat. We know that Earth is not flat. This book is wrong. Let's throw it out. Bhaktivinoda compares this to a person who is running a race of 10 laps. And after one lap, this person notices that there's something not perfect. So this person starts again from the first. And then he runs 2 laps. Okay, let's start again. 3 laps. It doesn't work out. I'll start again. So this is the useless critic, the person who is just interested in breaking down, in saying, you are wrong. You are wrong, Ananga Manjari. That was a mistake. Never translate again. So this is a useless person who just interested in breaking down other people or breaking down other people's thought. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that we should be critics, but we should be true critics. A true critic is a person who is interested in progression, in preserving what is good, and then building on that. Instead of just being interested in finding faults, finding what is good, and then keeping that, and then, if necessary, going on. But interestingly enough, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in his speech, he says that out of these 2 bad readers, the useless readers and the shallow critics, the Srimad Bhagavatam has suffered most from the useless readers, the non-reflective readers, because they have kept the Srimad Bhagavatam in a form that doesn't work anymore. They haven't been up to the task of reinterpreting the Bhagavatam so that it will be useful for new generations. They've simply stuck to an old form that doesn't work anymore. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he also gives examples of useless critics or the shallow critics. He first mentions Ram Mohan Roy, who was a reformer, a Bengali Hindu reformer in early 19th century, who was interested in Vedanta, but who had no room in his thinking for the Bhagavatam. But then he also mentions himself. That's very interesting. He gives himself as an example of a young person who had grown up knowing that there is such a thing as the Bhagavatam, but being taught in school that this is an example of the worst kind of Hindu book available. Immoral, nonsensic, full of all kind of old-fashioned ideas. Exactly the kind of thing that we have to get rid of. Bhaktivinoda Thakur doesn't explicitly refer or say this, but there were thinkers in the middle of the 19th century, Bengali thinkers, who thought that Krishna is a wonderful and important spiritual teacher. Probably not God, but an important spiritual teacher. But the important spiritual teacher is the Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita. The Krishna of the Bhagavatam, that's something completely different. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna speaks very nice things about fulfilling your duty and the importance of selfless action and so on. Good teachings. But the Krishna of the Bhagavatam, he's dancing in the forest with other people's wives. He's doing all these crazy and immoral and dangerous things. So Krishna of the Gita, good. Krishna of the Bhagavatam, we chuck him away. So Bhaktivinoda, he had also been influenced by these kind of ideas. So he's mentioning himself also as this kind of shallow critic, whose understanding of the Srimad Bhagavatam had to be reshaped. He had to unlearn what he thought he knew about the Srimad Bhagavatam. And this he did through Chaitanya Dev. Throughout this Bhagavata speech, Bhaktivinoda, he again and again refers to Chaitanya. He calls him the prophet of Nadia, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, our Chaitanya. So it's clearly a person who he knows that his listeners, the listeners to his speech, they know this person. But he's also trying to stress his importance for understanding the Srimad Bhagavatam. And this is very important and very interesting, because Prabhupada, he does the same thing when he starts his great project of translating the Srimad Bhagavatam into English. If you read Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, you'll remember that before he gets into the first verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam, he has a very long introduction, which is all about the life of Chaitanya, which at first sight seems like a very strange thing. He's not speaking about the life of the author or the life of the central person in the book. He's speaking about the life of a person who lived literally thousands of years after the book itself. But like Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Prabhupada there shows us that the key to understanding the Srimad Bhagavatam comes through the life and precepts of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. What is the Bhagavatam then? Bhaktivinoda asks in his talk after having spoken about these things. And he quotes two different verses. The first verse that he quotes is the third verse of the first chapter of the first canto. Nigamakal pataror galitam balam shukamukhadam ritadrava samyutam pibata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho bhuvika rasika bhuvibhavuka. The Srimad Bhagavatam is the ripened fruit of the tree of the Vedas, made even more sweet by the beak of the parrot Shuka. O connoisseurs of rasa, please drink this nectar of the Bhagavatam until you pass out, and then get up and drink more. And then he quotes another verse from the Garuda Purana, which says, Sarva Vedeti Hasanam Saram Saram Samudritam. The Srimad Bhagavatam is the essence of all the Vedas and Itihasas. So Bhaktivinoda is interestingly pointing out two aspects of the Srimad Bhagavatam. The Srimad Bhagavatam is a book of rasa. It's a book of nectar, but it's also a book of philosophy. It's the essence of all the Vedas and Itihasas. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur shows this latter point in this talk by next going into the Chatu Shloki of the Bhagavatam. In the second canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, there's a section of not, interestingly enough, 4 verses, but 7 verses that are called the 4 central verses of the Srimad Bhagavata. Kind of interesting mathematics. But out of these 7, of course, 4 are kind of the centerpiece. And in these 4 verses, Brahma hears from Krishna about the world, about himself, and about God. All different Vedanta philosophers, they deal with 3 different topics. Ishvara, or God, Jiva, individual self, and Jagat, or the world, and how these 3 relate to each other. And in these 4 central verses of the Srimad Bhagavatam, in a very, very terse and concentrated way, Krishna speaks to Brahma about these things, how everything comes from him, how everything rests in him, and how everything returns to him at the end. And how everything that is seen as separate from him, or the very act of seeing something separate from him, that is Maya. So Bhaktivinoda, he gets into a discussion in this point of the talk about Maya or illusion. In his time was a heavily debated concept. Illusion, of course, Maya is a central term in the philosophy of Shankara, in the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta. But it was also a term that was ridiculed by many Western philosophers of his time. There is, in Western philosophy, a powerful trend of philosophy that is called idealism, that is usually exemplified by the teaching or the philosophy of Bishop Berkeley in England. But in Bhaktivinoda's time, in the 19th century, idealism was very much criticized because it seemed so unrealistic. Rather, realism was the predominant philosophy. Whatever we see around us, that is real. We can do mistakes. We do mistakes all the time. But in general, whatever we experience is real. And that's why we can do things. We shouldn't just shut ourselves up in some room and think about philosophy and does the world exist or not. Instead, we should go out in the world and do something useful. This is the time of criticism, of idealism, being on the level of, if somebody says that, I wonder if the world is real, kick that person in the head with the boot and he or she will see whether it is real or not. So a very kind of crude anti-idealist philosophy was prevalent in the West and in Western education in this time. So Mayavad, Shankara's idea of illusion, the world being illusory, was seen as this kind of theoretical, very unpractical, very kind of basically stupid by many Western philosophers of these days. So Bhaktivinoda, when he goes into this discussion of Maya in this talk, he's influenced by this kind of thinking. He's saying, yes, the world is real. The world is not simply illusion. But we don't always see it in the real way. And the power to delude us, that power also comes from God. So Maya is not just illusion. Maya is also a power of God. So we can see already here in 1869, just at the beginning of his reading of the Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhaktivinoda has already grasped some of the more finer and more important conceptions of Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy. What is Maya? How does the Gaudiya Vaishnava understanding of Maya differ from the understanding of Maya in other Indian philosophies? Bhaktivinoda Thakur goes on to speak about Sambandha. He makes this tripartite tripartite explanation of Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy that Krishnadas Kaviraj brings up so prominently in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, that is that all of the scriptures speak about three topics: Sambandha, Abhidheya, and Prayojana. Sambandha being about relationship and being about creating a kind of conceptual foundation, like our Guru Maharaj likes to say. Who is God? What is the world? What is the individual soul? And he quotes the Vadanti Tattvavidas verse, Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Probably you all are familiar with this verse, or the third chapter of, I think second chapter of the first canto, 1 to 11 maybe, that the seers of the truth, they have understood the truth to be non-dual consciousness. But this non-dual consciousness can be understood as Brahman, Paramatma, or Bhagavan. And he then goes on to explain how the Abhidheya, or the path towards God, is the path of bhakti. And he already opens up here in a short way, but still he opens up the idea that bhakti can take many different forms, all the way from Shanta, or this kind of passive adoration of God, through Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, all the way up to Madhurya. So again, we can see how Bhaktivinoda Thakur is reading the Srimad Bhagavatam really through the lens of the Chaitanya Charitamrita, in which, again, the ideas and understandings of Jiva Goswami are so prominently displayed. But then Bhaktivinoda Thakur, in his talk, he goes into another direction, which is very interesting. In this talk, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, as I say, he is still a young man who has just come to the Srimad Bhagavatam with a new understanding and new respect for the text. But he's still incorporating many Western ideas as well. And some of the things that he is saying in this talk are things that he was later going to re-evaluate. For example, famously in this talk, Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that some parts of the Srimad Bhagavatam are to be taken allegorically. For example, when the Srimad Bhagavatam speaks about the different hells, that's not to be taken literally, that's an allegory. And some Western readers of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, they have made much of these kind of statements. But Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he does change his opinion sometimes. And in some cases, his understanding went through developments. He's more radical, we could say, in this early text than he is in his later texts. Nevertheless, here he quotes Emerson. Emerson is a famous piece where thinkers that reacted against the kind of Christian orthodoxy of the United States of their times, and were interested in trying to understand God in new ways. They were inspired by the Romantic movement, inspired by the idea of individualism, by the idea of the personal conscience, and so on. And some of them were also inspired by Eastern thoughts, most famously Henry David Thoreau, who is sometimes called the first North American yogi. Thoreau himself called himself a yogi once, not completely earnestly, but with some degree of seriousness. Thoreau studied the Bhagavad Gita and was inspired by it. Anyway, this Emerson, he is a famous transcendentalist philosopher, and Bhaktivinoda quotes him in the context of something very interesting, he says, Bhaktivinoda says, matter is the dictionary of spirit. I tried to Google this phrase before this class, and I couldn't find anybody else saying it. So it's apparently something that Bhaktivinoda comes up with himself. Matter is the dictionary of spirit. What he means by this is that through matter, we can understand something of spirit. And really that it goes in both directions. Spirit can only be understood by an ordinary kind of gross person like me. It can only be understood through material examples. If I hear about Krishna, I need to hear that Krishna is blue, he has yellow clothes, he has 2 arms, he has a garland around his neck, he's holding a flute, he has a peacock feather in his hair. And when I hear all of these things, I'm thinking of material things. I'm thinking of blue as I have seen blue or imagined blue. I'm thinking of a peacock feather as I have seen one. So I'm thinking of material things. But through these material things, I'm getting some kind of an inkling of Krishna. Bhaktivinoda gives the example of time and how time can be grasped through a watch or a clock. You can get some understanding of time through a clock. Similarly, we can get some kind of understanding of spirit through material words. It's quite interesting that Bhaktivinoda says this, because this is a teaching which does not really correspond with the teachings of the Goswamis, where the idea rather is that the description of Krishna is not really material, but rather it is spiritual sound that just takes form that looks material. So whether Bhaktivinoda here is still kind of reflecting an understanding of spiritual matters that is conditioned by his reading of Emerson and so on, or if he's simply speaking about it in a way that will be easier to understand for his readers or listeners, this we cannot know, but it's still a very interesting idea. Matter is the dictionary of spirit. And the idea that you can understand something of spirit through matter. If you look at the world, for example, you can understand something about God. Since, of course, the world and God are not totally different from each other, the world being God's energy. After in this way speaking about Sambandha and Abhidheya, Bhaktivinoda, of course, goes on to speak about Prayojana, or the ultimate goal of the Srimad Bhagavatam, being that of bhakti, or love for God. He says that bhakti is something difficult to understand, but devotion, love, these kind of words, they can give us some kind of inkling of what it means. And interestingly, he at this point in the talk, he's also kind of tracing a development of bhakti from a tamasic life, where you're kind of caught up in sin, caught up in bad actions, and then through rajas, through kind of getting some energy into yourself, then gradually then evolving into sattva, and then from sattva taking another leap into bhakti. Here again, Bhaktivinoda, I think, is influenced by the kind of thinking of his age where action was so very important, that you have to do things, because his description of bhakti here is very much one of bhakti as kind of enlightened action, that you don't just sit, you actually do something, but you do something good for the world. Towards the end of his talk now, and we're getting towards closer to the end, he mentions two great errors that we can fall into when studying or trying to understand God. He says the first error is to think that God is without attributes, is beyond attributes. This is what in Sanskrit would be called nirvishesha. He doesn't use that term here, but that God is without attributes, that God can't be described. And this sounds good. God is so big and so wonderful that we cannot describe him with our human words. And in some religions, they do speak like this. But Bhaktivinoda says that this is a useless philosophy. Because if we can't describe God, if we can't conceptualize or think about God, then what are we to do? Then there's no kind of connection between us and God. It sounds good, but in real life, it doesn't work. If we can't say that God is anything, if you can't say that God is the creator or God is the maintainer or God is love or anything, then God ceases to exist. If you can't even say that God is everything, that's also an attribute, then we could just as well say that God doesn't exist. It doesn't make any practical difference. So that's one of the two great errors in speaking about God. God is without attributes. The other error, Bhaktivinoda says here, is to say that God is simply attributes. That God is love, God is consciousness, God is eternity, and so on. And this is also a mistake, because then God simply becomes these separate attributes, like a hodgepodge of different ideas. So he says the way to reconcile this is to think of God as a superhuman personality that has attributes. Not that he is without attributes, not that he is attributes, but that he has attributes. Were you able to follow Arangamajari? I can't hear you, but I hope you were. So God is not without attributes. He isn't attributes, but he has attributes. He's a person who has attributes. Now, from this kind of high theological or philosophical point of view, Bhaktivinoda comes down to kind of the practical reality. Pretending to be a philosophical opponent, he's saying, all of this sounds good, but you're saying that this Bhagavata is such a great book, it's speaking about all of these things. If it's such a great book, how come the people who say that they like this book are so useless? We have all these vairagis, these renunciates, who set up an ashram, and then they live in that ashram, this great renunciate man with 8 sevadasis, servant ladies, and they study the Srimad Bhagavatam together, and whenever necessary, the ladies go out for an abortion, and it's these kind of immoral, useless people who study the Srimad Bhagavatam. How can it be such a great book if it leads to these kind of results? Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he says, you can't judge a book by the kind of followers that it has. All good and great ideas will always be perverted by humans. You'll always find people who take something beautiful and make it into something dirty. But don't be the shallow critic again. Don't think that because not everybody understood it, nobody can understand it. The Srimad Bhagavatam, he stresses several times in the talk, is a difficult text. It's written in Sanskrit, which in Bhaktivinoda's time, educated people could understand in Bengal, but only to some particular level. The Srimad Bhagavatam is written in very difficult Sanskrit. Even a person who is otherwise conversant in Sanskrit will not be able to understand everything in the Srimad Bhagavatam. So Bhaktivinoda, he stresses many times we have to read the Srimad Bhagavatam with the commentary of Sridhar Swami. It's interesting that he's referring to Sridhar Swami several times. Again, I think it's reflecting his understanding of the Srimad Bhagavatam as mediated by the Chaitanya Charitamrita, where Mahaprabhu, of course, many times speaks about the importance of studying the Srimad Bhagavatam with the commentary of Sridhar Swami. But probably it also reflects Bhaktivinoda's own experience. The Bhagavatam that he had finally been able to catch hold of was a Bhagavatam with the commentary of Sridhar Swami. It's by far the most common commentary in manuscripts of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And even other commentaries, such as the commentary of Vishwanath Chakravarti and so on, which we might imagine that Bhaktivinoda would speak more about, is based on the commentary of Sridhar Swami. So he's saying the Srimad Bhagavatam is a difficult book. You won't be able to understand it just on its own. You'll need the commentary of Sridhar Swami. And then you'll also be able to kind of avoid these kind of pitfalls that some people fall into who take the Srimad Bhagavatam to somehow give license to their immoral conduct. Finally, at the end of the talk, very interestingly, Bhaktivinoda Thakur says that apart from all of these other things I said so far, the Srimad Bhagavatam contains two important principles. The first of these principles is the principle of liberty. He says that the Srimad Bhagavatam is a book that teaches us the importance of liberty in spiritual life. And he says, he mentions the story of Vyasadeva. Vyasadeva, having written all of these books, the Mahabharata, the Puranas, having divided up the Vedas into 4, but still feeling unsatisfied. So Narada came to him and said, you have to write a new book. Write the Srimad Bhagavatam. So he gave him the liberty to let go of these previous texts and go forward. Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, similarly, the spiritual seeker, and he uses one of my favorite words, he uses the word saragrahi to describe the spiritual seeker, the person who goes for the essence, not the shallow critic who throws away everything because of some fault, but who goes for the essence. This is my hope as well. I'm hoping that a saragrahi will see the essence in me and not throw me away because of my faults. So he's saying one of the main principles of the Srimad Bhagavatam is the principle of liberty in spiritual life. Don't get trammeled. Don't get caught down by old forms that maybe worked in a previous time. Vyasadeva had to let go of the Mahabharata and write something new, the Srimad Bhagavatam. And he says, Similarly, we also have to try to continue on, try to progress in spiritual life. And this is the second important principle here, the principle of progress. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he sees spiritual life here, especially now here in the beginning of his career as a Gaudiya Vaishnava, as a path of continuous progress. You first learn that God exists, then you learn that he's a person, then you learn that you can love God in many different ways, and you progress step by step on the path. Throughout this, I think, very fascinating speech, Bhaktivinoda is such an optimist. You can really feel this young man's enthusiasm. We are going forward. We're leaving the past behind. We're finding something beautiful, something new. And we should always have this feeling that I have advanced. And I think this is something that we can take also from this speech, to think that every day I need to make some spiritual advancement. This principle of progress, not being satisfied with just doing everything as we always did it, but learning new things, reading the same books but in new ways, learning them in new ways, doing the same puja of the same Krishna, but understanding the puja in new ways, deepening it, making it more heartfelt every day. And from these two principles of liberty and progress, Bhaktivinoda finally, in his concluding his talk, he also combines these two into what we could call liberality, quoting this Avatara Yasankyeya verse of the 3rd chapter of the 1st canto. Bhaktivinoda says that according to the Bhagavata, the avatars or the descents of the Lord are innumerable. And the Vaishnava is taught in the Srimad Bhagavatam to view persons such as Narada as Shakti-avesha avatars of the Lord. Similarly, the Vaishnava can view persons such as Jesus as Shakti-avesha avatars of the Lord. So the Vaishnava has this kind of broad understanding of spirituality. All of these different spiritual teachers and persons, I see them as avatars or empowered beings empowered by my Lord. So he's saying the Srimad Bhagavatam teaches a universal religion, a religion that can embrace everybody. So I wanted to go through this talk of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's on the Bhagavatam on this day. I didn't just want to read it, but to try to summarize it in my own words. But of course, I encourage all of you to take the opportunity to read it when you have the time. You can just Google it and you'll find it online. It's a wonderful speech. It reflects, I think, in a beautiful way, the kind of spiritual milieu Bhaktivinoda Thakur was in when he wrote this, but it also reflects some of the very unique and very, very sweet heart of Bhaktivinoda Thakur's. His love for the Srimad Bhagavatam, his love for Krishna already in this time, it's so unimaginable. It's 11 years before he got initiation. What did we speak about the Srimad Bhagavatam 11 years before we got initiation? This is really a measure of Bhaktivinoda's greatness. So again, I want to offer my humble obeisances to Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur on this Divine Appearance Day of his. Any questions or comments?
Haribol.
Haribol.
Pranam and thank you. This is a kind of a vague comment because I don't remember exactly, but regarding the like about reflecting on what you hear from the Bhagavatam. I remember reading in Bhakti Pramod Puri Maharaj's The Art of Sadhana, there was some shastric like story about like Bhagavatam recitations and what happens to the speaker after the recitation, and what happens to the listeners who don't reflect, and what happens to those who do reflect. But that's all I remember from it. But yeah,
yeah, thank you. Jiva Goswami, he quotes a verse like this in Bhakti Sandarbha. This is not just me being this Shastra Nipun, I remember every verse, but I actually read it yesterday, so that's why I remember it. It's in. It says that a person who teaches without reflection and who listens without reflection, both of them will go to a terrible hell. So it's a heavy verse, and Jiva Goswami he makes the point there that he's speaking about bhakti, the kind of bhakti which is not motivated by ruchi or taste, but by vichara or reflection. But nevertheless, even though he is speaking about a particular kind of bhakti there, he is making the point that this is very important, this kind of reflection. Because, of course, we are, as human beings, we are a composite of different parts. We have our bodies, and we need to use the bodies in service of Krishna. We can use the whole body in service of Krishna. We are also to use the mind in service of Krishna, learning to like Krishna, learning to dislike things that are not connected with Krishna. But we're also to use the intellect, the buddhi in Krishna's service. And some of us have very poor bodies, some have poor minds, some have poor intellects, but we all have these things. Even if we can't cook so nicely like Sakyarati, for example, we still can do something for Krishna. And we're not so brilliant like Shamananda, but we do have some brilliance. And this brilliance we can use for Krishna's service. So reflection, that's important. For some people, Jiva Goswami is writing, it's more important. That's kind of their life. Their life is thinking, sitting and thinking, I wonder how this is. Could this be seen in that way? They will be inspired by this. But even if we're not a person like that, we will have some amount of this kind of reflexive capacity. And we are to use that both when speaking and when listening. Thank you for bringing up that verse, Shamananda. There was something in the chat here by Chris. Which is the book or the conversation of Bhaktivinoda? This talk that I was speaking about, it's a talk called the Bhagavata. It's philosophy, it's ethics, and it's theology. And that is a speech that Bhaktivinoda gave and then wrote into a kind of a booklet afterwards. So that was what I was speaking about. Anything else? If not, dear devotees, it is my pleasure and my honor to have been given the opportunity to speak on this important day, the Advent Day of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. I hope that in speaking in this way, I have not given offense to anybody, and that I have been able to glorify the great Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Thank you all for listening. I hope to see you soon again. Jai Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. Gaur Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bo.
Sriman Brighupada Prabhu ki jai.
Jai.
Hari Bo.